So without further ado, we'd like to begin the first session today, entitled Biological Effects and Public Health. This session will welcome 4 experts. The first speaker today is Professor Timothy MOUSSEAU from the University of South Carolina. He would be talking about impact of radiation, wildlife in Chernobyl and in Fukushima. His specialty is biology, genetics, adaptation, among other areas. Following Professor MOUSSEAU, we will have Professor Yutaka Hamaoka, who is from the University of Tokyo. He will be talking about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Hanford, and Fukushima, critical review and reanalysis of radiation epidemiological studies. This first session will be led by Professor Keith Weberstock and Professor Susumu Shimazono. As co-chairs, I'd like to give the microphone to the co-chairs, please.
Well, good morning, everybody. First, I'd like to express my gratitude to the organizers for inviting me to come to this symposium. This will be my 4th symposium, and each one has become more important than the previous one, and this is no exception. This is the most important symposium, I think, in the series, because we are really going to discuss the science behind the health consequences of exposure to ionizing radiation. So without further introduction, I would like just to ask Professor MOUSSEAU to talk about the effects of radiation on wildlife. I would just say that Professor MOUSSEAU is a pioneer in this field. He did the early work after the Chernobyl accident and was well prepared when the Fukushima accident occurred to start exploring the effects on the local wildlife around the accident site. So, Professor MOUSSEAU, please.
Are we on? There we go. Konnichiwa! It really is a great privilege to be back at this meeting, to see you again, and to share with you some of the latest findings from our research over the past few years. And I hope it will be of interest to you. Now, before I get started, for real, I need to mention that of course, I need to acknowledge my supporters and my collaborators, lest I forget about them later. We wouldn't want to do that. But let me start by, let's see, I'm not sure how best to do this. There's no mouse, okay. The mouse, just use this one, okay, for the pointer. Very good, thank you. Got it. In any case, with technical glitches aside, I need to acknowledge Chubu University near Nagoya that has been supporting our research for the past year. I've been a visiting professor there. And my partner in research for the past 15 years, Anders Moller at the CNRS in France, 2 particularly important collaborators. Right, so before I get started here, you know, I used to get this question all the time. Why are you studying Chernobyl? Why are you bothering? Up until a few years ago, everyone thought it was a unique event that could never happen again, that it was really just the product of Soviet engineering and Soviet management practices, and that we would never see such an event again. But of course, we all know that there have been other such events. There have been actually quite a few accidents, but three major ones at commercial nuclear power plants, starting with 3 Mile Island in the United States, followed by the biggest event, at least for terrestrial impacts, Chernobyl, and of course the latest one in Fukushima. But there have been a multitude of other smaller incidents and accidents over the years at these power plants. And in fact, a recent study just published earlier this year and promoted by the MIT Technology Review, many of you may have seen it, where they did a very detailed analysis of the probability of accidents and at different scales. And they predicted that there would be another Chernobyl scale event by the year 2050, and probably a 3-mile island scale event within the next 10 years or so. So it's clear that even the engineers feel that these accidents and incidents are likely to continue, and this is especially true given that most of the nuclear power plants in the world are aging and getting a little older. But there are many other reasons for studying the effects, the basic science of radiation effects, and one of them is the fact that that every nuclear power plant, by design, emits vast quantities of radioactive materials every year. Of course it does. It has to. This is what fission produces, and these products have to be diluted and released into the environment. Of course, we see this over and over. We don't talk about it much, but this really is an important issue. And this graph right here is just a graph I've borrowed from a National Academy of Science report that lists some of the effluents at various power plants. This is for US power plants. I'm sure Japanese power plants are very similar. And these are legal releases. Let me get that clear. But of course, there are many illegal, unregulated releases that are occurring. We tend not to notice them because the monitoring around nuclear power plants has not been particularly extensive over the years. A few years ago, some community groups, some citizen scientists noticed that there was tritium, radioactive water, leaking off of one of the power plant sites. It was noticed because it was leaking beyond the usual boundary of the power plant and into the groundwater in the surrounding areas, and thus of potential interest, of potential health concern to the residents of the area, and certainly the wildlife. And at the time, a special panel of the National Academy of Sciences was convened to discuss whether or not what we knew about the impacts of tritium. And the answer after 2 days of discussion was that we knew very, very little about what happens to tritium in nature, as it were, what the impacts might be. There had been very, very little research done on this question, and of course it's a very important question because tritium continues to be released in all of these power plants. Many of them are leaking beyond their boundaries. Another reason for being interested in the basic science is that we're now starting to get a much better idea concerning the epidemiological aspects of power plants, and we'll probably hear a little bit more about this later today. There was a recent meta-analysis published by Ian Farrelly where he took basically all of the studies that had been done in the past, put them together, and did a sort of super analysis, a meta-analysis of the analyses. And basically the message was very clear and quite similar to the individual results, but they're much more powerful statistically when you put them together. And the basic message was that if you are a pregnant woman living within 3 miles of a nuclear power plant, downwind from a nuclear power plant, you have a significantly higher chance of having an infant with leukemia, for instance. And so this really is pretty overwhelming evidence for most of us, and certainly cause for interest in doing more. Another reason for being interested in the basic science of radiation effects is that we have actually exploded many nuclear bombs over the years. These were the first 2 that were dropped on people. We had the 60th anniversary last month. Very little science done with respect to the consequences other than the most obvious immediate effects. But in terms of the long-term consequences for environmental effects of the radiation that was released from these kinds of atomic bombs, we really know very little, to be honest. In Marshall Islands, of course, there were many bombs dropped by the US military in the 50s and 60s. And in fact, one thing I hadn't realized until recently was just how many atomic bombs have been exploded over the last 50, 60 years. 2,710 atomic bomb tests, 1,193 above-ground atomic tests done, releasing vast amounts of radioactive materials into the environment all over the world. But Marshall Islands come to mind, but parts of the Sahara, and of course parts of China, many other parts of the world contaminated by these atomic bomb testing. But of course, the two biggest reasons for being interested in the basic science of radiation effects, low-dose radiation effects, come from Chernobyl, the Chernobyl event of 1986, when nuclear fire burned for 10 days, as most of you know, releasing vast quantities of radioactive material, not just in Ukraine and Belarus and Russia, but also through parts of Scandinavia and Central Europe, vast areas contaminated. So much so that even today in Germany, the wild boar, which feed on mushrooms, many of them cannot be eaten because they exceed the levels of cesium contamination that's allowable. So still major effects, of course, in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, but also in other parts of Europe. And then, of course, we have Fukushima. Again, a major disaster. Luckily, many people probably don't realize how fortunate we were. If you can call the disaster fortunate in any way, we were very fortunate that it occurred when it occurred in March. If it had occurred at any other time of the year, the fallout would have landed on more populated parts of Japan and much larger quantities. Our group published a paper earlier this year which modeled the weather conditions at different times of the year and found that it was just extremely fortunate that the wind was blowing out to sea at this time of the year, thus saving many people. But again, vast areas of terrestrial areas contaminated. The impacts on the ocean largely unknown at this point, although we're starting to see contaminants showing up on the west coast of North America as well. Another reason that has motivated our research have been statements like this one by the International Atomic Energy Agency's Chernobyl Forum. When we got started in working in Chernobyl, we were just curious. We were just scientists, biologists, curious about what effects radiation might have in natural populations. All the previous work had been done in laboratories for the most part, or in very artificial conditions. No sort of natural studies had been done. And then the UN Chernobyl Forum report was released and suggests that, and you've all seen the videos, I'm sure, on television, the animals are doing great. There's many animals inside the Chernobyl zone because there's a fence and there's no hunting. And so the effects of people directly are much larger than the effects of radiation. That's the implication of such statements. But, and of course, more recently, many of you in this room have probably seen this UNSCAR report from last year, where they basically suggested the same kind of thing for Fukushima, that there would be no consequences for the biota, the animals and plants living in the region. And of course, this was the basis for the International Atomic Energy Agency report that just came out a few weeks ago, right? And where they basically suggest that there will be no effects of the Fukushima fallout, and at least for the animals. They suggest the same for people too, of course. But there is no rigorous data to support this position. They make these statements in these reports without reviewing all of the relevant literature. They review part of the literature that they themselves have generated in one way or another, but they do not review the broader scientific literature, the literature generated by independent scientists who work in universities and research institutes working on their own independently of industry or government labs. And so, and in fact, these latest two reports by UNSCAR and by the IAEA Director General's report, they ignore all of the data that has been generated in the last 10 years for Chernobyl and the last 4 years for Fukushima. And so today, the rest of my time, I'm going to review a few of the key results that we've made in the last few years that bear on this. And just a quick review. We've been working there, the group that I work with, in Chernobyl since 2000 and in Fukushima since July of 2011. We got here as soon as we could. Mostly interested in models, animal and plant models. We are animals ourselves, and so the other animals in the world don't behave too differently than we do in terms of our basic biology, and so there should be some relevance. We've made many visits to Chernobyl, many visits to Fukushima. In fact, I've just spent 2.5 weeks in Fukushima doing work on mice and moths and large mammals, and just got here today from field work in Fukushima. We've published many papers related to this, and I invite you to go to our website if you are interested in seeing these publications. We are simple biologists. We're not health practitioners. We're driven. Our motives for this work are curiosity and an interest in scientific exploration. That is our main driving force. The fact that many people around the world think what we're doing is interesting, that's an added bonus, but that's not really what keeps most scientists going. It's curiosity, sense of curiosity and discovery. We pose very simple questions and hypotheses, and we don't care what the answer is. And the simplest question is, do the sorts of dose rates that we see in Chernobyl and Fukushima, do they lead to increased mutation rates? Is there any consequence for genetics? Even if there are genetic effects, do these genetic effects matter? We all have many mutations that we carry around. Every cell division in our bodies leads to 50 mutations, 50 chromosome breaks that have to be repaired following cell division. And so this is just, it could be that this added mutational, this added radiation may not really be that important. That's a possibility. If there are mutations, if there are some consequences to it, do they lead to changes in fitness, survival, number of offspring, etc.? So we start by looking at the very simple question of, are there changes in the DNA? Are there mutations? Is there genetic damage that results from the exposure levels that we see in Chernobyl and Fukushima? We've done quite a number of different techniques to look at this, including using microsatellite DNA markers, DNA fingerprints. Our preferred method is the COMET assay because it's cheap and quick and we can use it on any organism, but we've done many other kinds of approaches. The COMET assay is really kind of cute, and because it actually visualizes the chromosome breaks very clearly. You can actually see this is a cell with no damage, our nucleus with no damage. Here's a nucleus with intermediate levels of damage, pieces of chromosomes that are pushed off. And in this one, very high levels of damage where the chromosomes are broken up substantially by very high doses. And I'm not going to tell you about some of the individual studies we've done. What I want to mention, though, is a summary paper, a review paper, a meta-analysis that we published earlier this year, where we looked at all of the genetic studies that have been done related to Chernobyl effects in animals and plants, in people, and put them together, did this composite summary meta-analysis, and published this paper. And one thing I do want to mention, since this is a citizen science meeting, it's very important that it's often hard to tell what's good science and what's bad science, right? And this is something that comes up all the time. You hear something on the news, you see something on television. For instance, last week there was a giant wolffish reported that was caught off Hokkaido, and somebody suggested, oh, it must be Fukushima. And of course, it was very unlikely due to Fukushima. But there was no science behind this. Science usually requires a publication. And so when you are reading about something, look to see that there is a publication, a scientific publication associated with it in some scientific journal that's peer-reviewed. And some of them, like this one here, are open source. That means anybody can go read it for free on the internet. This one was published here, and the basic results from all of the studies done on Chernobyl are summarized in this graph. I apologize for it. It's a little abstract, but what this graph shows, each one of these lines is an individual study done on genetic effects related to Chernobyl, and it shows sort of the mean effect and sort of the standard error of the estimate, how reliable that point was. This is the zero line. So anything that's above this line means that there was a significant positive effect, increased levels of genetic damage in one form or another related to radiation. If it's below this line, it means it was positive. There was no, in fact, there was less genetic damage for a couple of these studies here in the more radioactive areas. But by and large, overwhelming, low-dose radiation leads to genetic damage. Most of it's, and of course, most of it's not good. So let's just, we can go along with that and assume that there are likely to be increased mutational loads in these populations. What are the consequences for the plants and animals living in these areas? So we've been working on this question for 15 years, as I mentioned. Actually, my collaborator, Anders Mahler, has been working there since 1991, so even longer. One of the first things we noticed, just because it's easy to see, birds fly around, they're not too afraid of people, and you can get quite close to them, especially here in Japan, where they like to nest above the door, and so many people get to see their barn swallows up close and personal, as it were, follow their offspring and follow the families through time. And the first thing we noticed on these barn swallows was that some of them were showing these patches of white feathers on their bodies that had not been seen at any level, any frequency, anywhere else other than Chernobyl. And we thought this was odd and very unusual, but probably significant. We started looking at all other species of birds that we could catch, and many of these other species also showed these anomalous white feathers. Now, having some white feathers probably doesn't hurt the bird, probably doesn't make it more difficult for the bird to find food. It may make the bird less sexy to female birds, but that's that's another topic. But anyway, highly statistically significantly more patches of these white feathers. It's a marker of the genetic effects of the radiation. Of course, when we started working in Fukushima in July, we started looking at the Tsubame, the barn swallows as well. And in July 2012, June of 2012, we noticed the first barn swallow with a patch of white feathers in Fukushima. And since then, we've been working with, collaborating with local citizens groups, including the Wild Bird Society of Japan, a very active group. They have been looking at barn swallows all around Fukushima. And I think every year we are finding more and more of these barn swallows with little patches of white feathers. Again, it's just a marker for the radiation exposure, but it probably is an indicator of something more important. And most of you have probably heard about the cows of Namie. They are showing some of them show white patches of fur. We don't know if it's the same thing, if it's the same mechanism, but I think it is maybe not a coincidence that some of the animals are showing up with patches of white fur and are much lighter colored than they would normally be. We also then started using, let's see if I can get the video to play. Will the video play? Maybe it will. Yes, it will. We developed a method for extracting fresh genetic material from male birds in the springtime so that we could look at their performance. And this was important to us because male infertility is a major cause of lower population growth rates. Again, a question of great significance in human populations. What we learned was that performance of the sperm in these birds was negatively impacted by a combination of radiation and oxidative stress. The two in combination led to major changes in sperm swimming performance in these birds, again, reflecting potential consequences of the radiation. We've looked at the sperm from 10 species in great detail using electron microscopes to look at the morphology. And in 9 of the 10 species, the sperm show much higher levels of deformities in the Chernobyl birds as compared to their Central or Western European counterparts. Again, major significant consequence. Oh, wrong direction. But this one was far a big surprise to us. In when we started collecting birds in large numbers from the very radioactive areas, one of the things we noticed was that in the most radioactive areas, these are areas that are quite hot, they're 50 microsieverts per hour, 50 micrograys per hour. In these spots of Chernobyl, we found that many of the birds, in this case about 40% of the birds, were completely sterile. They had no sperm or were just a few dead sperm. And this clearly could have natural implications for these populations. But it's not just DNA and sperm. We also find tumors and other kinds of abnormalities in many of the birds, like this tumor on the head of this great tit. Tumors on heads seem to be relatively common. Here's a tumor on the wing. Again, statistically much more frequent in the areas of high contamination. Very, very rarely seen in other populations. Another thing we've been looking at, again spawned by the interest from the atomic bomb survivor studies, one of the first things that was noticed that many people who survived the bombs were, they contracted cataracts in their eyes, and even children. And so we use this as our motivation to look at the birds in Chernobyl. And again, we found that the birds show a much higher frequency of cataracts in the more radioactive areas. And I invite you to go to the paper to see the data. We've now started to look at the rodents as well, and found that in the rodents, we are seeing increased levels of cataracts. This was a particularly pronounced example in the eye of this particular one. I'm not even sure what that is, but it's pretty amazing. But in terms of regular kinds of cataracts, opacities in the eyes, again, much higher incidence in the more radioactive areas in the mice, but only in the females. In this case, we see differential susceptibility or differential vulnerability, with females being more vulnerable than males. Another finding from atomic bomb studies, but also early studies, medical studies, where doctors were using radium and X-rays in the 20s to treat diseases, mainly cancers, I guess. And some of the women were pregnant at the time of treatment, as was the case in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What they noticed that was children, especially during, I think, the second trimester in particular, very vulnerable to the impacts of radiation of various sorts, leading to smaller heads, smaller brain size, reduced cognitive ability. When we looked at the birds in Chernobyl, the same thing. Smaller brains in the more radioactive areas, and more importantly, reduced, what appears to be evidence for reduced cognitive ability, in that survival from one year to the next was lower for the birds with smaller brains. We've been looking at the rodents as well, the mice and the voles from Chernobyl, and also in Fukushima. In fact, we just finished a study of brain size this past week. We have 170 more mice to add to this graph from Fukushima, and so we'll have a much better idea of what's going on there. But the basic story is the same: smaller brain size in the more radioactive areas. Basically, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that for some reason, no one had really looked very carefully in Chernobyl prior to when we started going there, and other radioactive places, it seems. There were a few people who were doing small studies, often not scientific, but a few sort of anecdotal reports, but nobody doing really, hardcore science. And the basic point is that every model system we look at, just about, we find evidence of some kind of dose-response relationship. It's usually not good. This is a classic one. This is a firebug. I haven't seen these in Japan, so I don't think they occur here. But can you see the face mask here? Let me mask it out here. You can see it better. Can you all see this? Looks like a mask for an African mask of some sort. Well, here's a normal one. When you go to Chernobyl, this is the range of morphological abnormalities that are just so easy to see. and the occurrence is much higher in the more radioactive areas. Again, these are just cues for the impacts of radioactivity. I'm going to, apparently, I'm running out of time. You've all heard about the pale blue grass butterflies studies by Professor Otaki in Okinawa. Wonderful work, really quite well done. The trees show deformities in Chernobyl. Many of you have seen this photo, classic photo from Professor Yablokov's book on Chernobyl. Well, just 2 weeks ago, published here in Japan, showing that the fir trees in Fukushima also are showing growth abnormalities in proportion to the radioactive contamination levels. This was a very well done study here in Japan, quite well controlled and quite strong evidence, again, showing these consequences. One last message, and that is, what about the abundance of animals in these areas? We see effects in sperm, we see effects on other modes of performance. Does that matter in terms of numbers? And because I'm running out of time, and some of you probably seen these things, earlier this year we published our 3 new papers concerning the impacts on the birds of Fukushima. One was to do with tsubame, barn swallows. The other 2 had to do with the rest of the bird community. The results are stunning. In Chernobyl, we had found that the birds declined by 66%, plus or minus, in the more radioactive areas, and diversity was down 50% in the more radioactive areas. In Fukushima, after 4 years of studying 400 different locations, we now have lots of data that shows very, very clearly that the numbers of birds drop off very, very significantly in the more radioactive areas. This is overwhelming evidence. It's been published. We've just done another reanalysis in collaboration with the IRNS in France, where they've actually done dose reconstruction for every bird in this model, in this system, so that we can do what the health physicists want us to do, and that is to do proper dose-response relationships. Very overwhelming effects. We also see drop-offs in biodiversity. So major effects in both in Chernobyl and in Fukushima. Let me skip the little videos, and let me just end by summarizing here. What does it all mean? Well, to begin with, contrary to the UN reports that we have come to rely on so much, there's now an abundance of information. There's an abundance of published scientific data from both Chernobyl and now also for Fukushima, showing that there are injuries to individuals, to populations, to communities, and even the ecosystem. These are well demonstrated, and just because they're not conducted by health physicists or radioecologists doesn't mean they're not valuable pieces of information for these committees to consider, and we hope they certainly will in the future. What should be done? So I spent the last 2 weeks in Fukushima, in Yamakiya. It's a town that was evacuated following the disaster. They're cleaning it up right now, and the residents are being told that they can go home in 4 months, 5 months from now. We got special permission to live in the house for the time we were doing research there. And the owner would come every day, and his questions to me were, will it be safe for my grandchildren to come visit me when I move back to my house in Yamakiya? Can I feed them the vegetables and berries and fruit that are growing in my garden? And nobody has answers for those questions. And certainly what we're trying to understand better is whether or not there are any really significant consequences for the plants and animals living at these kinds of levels. And that will tell us a little bit more about what the potential significance for humans will be. And the final point is that such efforts, such research efforts, really do need to be conducted by independent scientists whose interests are not politically motivated, who are not anti-nuclear activists or pro-nuclear activists. They're driven by curiosity and a search for knowledge, a search for answers to questions, rather than anything else. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for a fascinating talk. And this is now open for 10 minutes for questions. The questions should really, at this stage, be to elucidate points that Tim has made. We will have a session at the end of the 4 presentations for a general discussion. So do we have any questions for Tim MOUSSEAU now? Yeah.
Sorry, no good news.
Yes.
Do they need to come to a microphone?
Yeah, are there circulating microphones?
Please use the microphone, otherwise there is no sound field to the poor interpreter. I'm Kawane from the Citizens Group to think about the internal exposure. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to talk about the Chernobyl and Fukushima radionuclides difference. Although I understood the aerial doses, have you ever researched and studied the relationships between the radionuclides and the biota in Fukushima or Chernobyl?
I think I understood your question. I'm sorry. Yes, we have been looking at the internal pathways as well through ingestion. So yeah, we bring gamma spectrometers to the field and shielding, and we take our mice and our birds and we put them inside a little lead cave and we measure their own internal activity so that we get some idea of what kind of dose they're getting through ingestion. We've also been putting miniature dosimeters, implanting inside the bodies of the mice, and then releasing them back to the wild, and then recapturing them and removing the dosimeters so that we can look at the external dose that they're getting very accurately for each individual. On the birds, I didn't have time to show all of this, but in the birds, we've actually developed several new methods for putting dosimeters on their legs. And so the birds usually, sometimes they will stay in the breeding season, they will stick to the same area for a month or 2 months, sometimes a little longer. And so you can recapture the same bird in the same area. Some birds, like the barn swallow, the tsubami, they come back to the same nest the next year if they're alive. And so we've managed to retrieve several hundred dosimeters from those birds. And so we are getting quite good idea of the internal and external doses. And of course, we're also using the standard radioecology methods, the ERICA tool, to estimate the doses based on ambient levels and known radionuclide levels in the regions. I hope that answers your questions.
Actually, the question is that the relationships between the radionuclides and the plants and the animals in the Fukushima and Chernobyl. I'm Sakiyama. Mutation can be increased by the radiation, I understand, because of the mechanism. However, the reduction of the animal abundance, for example, if the bird population goes down in numbers, the large-scale decontamination is conducted in Fukushima, and therefore the surface soils are put in the flexible containers to remove. Therefore, there may be some impact from the decontamination work, and then decontamination work can have the negative impact on the numbers of the birds and the other organisms. It can be suspected. Therefore, not only doses of the radiation, of course, this is really linear relationships. The dose up, then the reduction. But I want to think about the interactions of the decontamination work in addition to the simple dose linear relationships.
No, very, very good question. Thank you so much for asking that. And So we have been, for the past 9 months, I've also been looking at the large mammals using camera traps. These are special cameras with motion-activated lights, and they capture pictures. And we have found that, yes, you are absolutely right. All of the activity associated with the decontamination, all of the trucks, all of the cars, all of the men, and of course the fact that they are taking the top layer of soil for about 10 meters on either sides of the roads, so not so much of an area, but all of the noise and the dirt and people is scaring many of the animals away. So you're absolutely right. We see more animals inside the zone than in that zone of decontamination. Now, but when we go beyond the zone of decontamination, where it's very clean and there's not that extra activity, things go back to normal, it seems, with the animals. The studies that we're reporting on the birds actually were mostly done before all of this decontamination effort, which has really just been the last year where most of it has happened. It was starting in the previous years, but this past year, it's just gone crazy. There are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of trucks and people, and it's really quite amazing. And the disturbance is likely to be much larger than the temporary noise as well, I think, because, yes, they have removed the top layer of soil, which may take a few years for the soil to recover from that impact. I hope somebody is studying the effects of this decontamination work as well. It's not clear to me that there's any basic science being done surrounding that question. I certainly hope there is.
Do we have another question?
Thank you very much for your always interesting report. Compared with Chernobyl, it's related to the first question. It's been 10 years after the Chernobyl event in Ukraine. The institution on the animals said that waterbird children can't stay long. One of the reasons for this short-lived is that strong MH3 is attached to the egg. So have you done this kind of research? And you talk about, well, as for the internal exposure, have you also done the research on the internal exposure versus the disease? That's my question.
Could you repeat the portion about the children?
Actually, it's not the children, but the eggshell accumulated the radiation, and therefore I'd like to know whether or not the accumulated radiation in the eggshell may kill the baby birds.
So the dose, the material in the eggshells. Yeah, so we've looked a little bit at in Chernobyl, where there was equal amounts of cesium and strontium released during the disaster. In Fukushima, in terms of the terrestrial impacts, it was mostly the initial event, which was cesium, iodine, and noble gases, but the noble gases and the iodine disappeared very quickly, and what persists now is just the two isotopes of cesium, cesium-134 and 137. No strontium, really very, very small amounts, if any. In Chernobyl, lots of strontium, and of course the strontium, being a calcium analog, is taken into the eggs of the birds, and so it's quite possible that this contributes to an extra external dose for the eggs, especially given that the eggs are shaped like a lens focusing the radiation on the embryo that's developing in the middle. That's one possibility. We've not looked directly at the relationship between strontium in the eggs and embryonic or developmental effects. It's very, very, very expensive to do strontium analyses, and also very difficult to collect the eggs. But It's expensive, time-consuming, and we haven't had the resources to do that, but it'd be worth doing. Here in Fukushima, we actually published a paper earlier this year that I mentioned that on the barn swallows, where we actually put TLDs into the nest, dosimeters into the nest to look at the actual radiation environment in the nest where the eggs were developing. And there does seem to be a relationship between the survival of the eggs and offspring and the egg and the nest environment. But again, the study was very small, too small because of lack of resources and a lack of, or the challenges of access for biologists to some of these very contaminated areas. It's gotten more difficult in some parts of Fukushima for biologists to gain entry. It's not a simple process, and some of the towns are restricting access to everybody as much as possible. So science is not being done. So that's another thing. Another recommendation is that there should be some concerted effort to put together a mechanism for independent scientists to be able to do research in this environment without so many difficulties.
Okay, we should move on now to the next speaker, but there will be an opportunity for further questions to Tim at the end of the 4 papers. So thank you, Tim. Very interesting talk.